Think like a strategist, move like a shadow, strike like thunder. Machiavelli's art of dominance. The moment you telegraph your next move, you've already surrendered your power. Think about it. When was the last time you announced your intentions before acting? When did you explain your strategy while executing it? If you're being honest with yourself, you've done this countless times. And every single time, someone anticipated you. Someone blocked you. Someone got there first. That visibility, it's the reason you're not where you deserve to be. While you're broadcasting signals, your competition is reading them and moving 3 steps ahead. They're operating in silence while you're performing in the spotlight. In this video, I'll reveal Machiavelli's 3-phase dominance system, a strategic framework so effective that those who master it become virtually untouchable. This is the art of thinking invisibly, positioning silently, and executing with overwhelming force. No warning, no mercy, no second chances. In 1513, Niccolò Machiavelli wrote The Prince while living in forced exile, stripped of political power, watching mediocrities occupy positions he once commanded. But Machiavelli understood something that transcends his era and pierces directly into yours. The architecture of power hasn't changed in 500 years. The weapons have evolved. The battlefield has shifted, but the fundamental dynamics of dominance remain identical. Modern society has trained you to believe that transparency equals integrity, that announcing your goals creates accountability, that visibility builds trust. This is perhaps the most successful psychological operation ever conducted on the masses. Because while you're being authentic and vulnerable, someone else is studying you, mapping your patterns, and positioning themselves to exploit every opening you've graciously revealed. The Prince wasn't written for the masses. It was written for the elite few who understand that power doesn't belong to the virtuous. It belongs to the strategic. Machiavelli observed that successful leaders shared 3 distinct operational phases. They thought like chess grandmasters, seeing 12 moves ahead while their opponents struggled with the current position. They moved like shadows, repositioning themselves without detection, invisible until the moment of decisive action. They struck like thunder, sudden, overwhelming, irreversible. Most people operate in reverse. They act impulsively, reveal their positions constantly, and wonder why their attempts at power consistently fail. They're playing checkers while the world operates on chess principles. They're shouting their coordinates while predators circle in silence. The uncomfortable truth? You've been conditioned to fail at power dynamics. Your education system rewarded compliance, not strategy. Your social conditioning praised openness, not discretion. Your entertainment normalized the hero who announces his presence and defeats enemies through sheer moral superiority. That's fiction. Reality rewards the opposite. But there's something even darker about this strategic framework, something Machiavelli understood but never explicitly stated. We'll get to that in a moment. First, you need to understand the cognitive architecture that makes this system devastatingly effective. Strategic thinking is the art of operating in a temporal dimension your opponents cannot access. Most people think in the present tense. Their cognition is dominated by immediate concerns, today's problems, this week's obligations, this month's goals. Their planning horizon extends roughly 30 days into the future before dissolving into vague aspirations. This is precisely why they're predictable. This is exactly why they're controllable. The strategist thinks in cascading probabilities. When you speak, the strategist isn't hearing your words. He's modeling your decision tree. He's mapping the logical consequences of your current trajectory. He's identifying the 3 points where your path becomes vulnerable to redirection. Before you've finished explaining your position, he's already identified the moment he'll dismantle it. Here's how this operates in reality. In 1502, Cesare Borgia, one of Machiavelli's primary case studies, faced a conspiracy of his own commanders. These men had served under Borgia, knew his methods, understood his ruthlessness. They plotted rebellion, believing they could anticipate his response. They prepared for military confrontation, fortified their positions, and consolidated their alliance. Borgia did something none of them modeled in their strategic calculations. He invited them to peace negotiations. He arrived with minimal security, demonstrating vulnerability. He offered generous terms, conceding points they hadn't even demanded. The conspirators, convinced they'd won through intimidation, accepted. They gathered in the town of Senigallia for the formal treaty signing. Borgia had constructed an 8-move sequence in his mind before the first invitation was sent. He understood that powerful men, when granted unexpected victory, experience cognitive euphoria that temporarily suppresses threat assessment. He knew they would interpret his concessions as weakness rather than positioning. He calculated that their arrogance would override their caution for precisely the window he needed. The moment they entered Senigallia, Borgia's hidden forces sealed the town. Within hours, every conspirator was captured. By morning, they were executed. The rebellion that threatened to fracture his power base was eliminated in a single night. Not through superior military force, through superior strategic architecture. The power dynamic here is critical to understand. Borgia's opponents were thinking 2 moves ahead, rebellion then negotiation. Borgia was thinking 8 moves ahead, invitation, acceptance, gathering, isolation, capture, execution, message dissemination, psychological consolidation. They were playing the current position. He was playing the end game. This is what Machiavelli meant when he wrote that the wise prince must act like the fox and recognize traps before entering them. But there's a deeper layer. The superior fox doesn't merely avoid traps. He recognizes that his opponent's minds are the actual trap, constrained by their cognitive limitations, and he engineers scenarios where their own decision-making apparatus becomes the mechanism of their destruction. Strategic thinking requires you to develop what intelligence professionals call red team cognition, the ability to inhabit your opponent's perspective with higher fidelity than they inhabit it themselves. You understand their motivations, their constraints, their blind spots, their decision triggers. You know what they'll do before they know it, not through mysticism, through systematic cognitive modeling. Now most people stop here. They read about strategic thinking, they feel intellectually stimulated, and they return to their reactive existence. But that's why they fail. There's a second layer to this system that transforms theoretical knowledge into practical dominance. Invisibility is not the absence of action. It's the perfection of camouflage during repositioning. The shadow doesn't hide by becoming smaller. It hides by synchronizing with the environment, moving when movement is expected, pausing when observation is heightened. This is the operational principle that separates competent strategists from masters of power dynamics. Most people confuse secrecy with effectiveness. They withdraw, they isolate, they operate in obvious silence, and they telegraph their intentions just as clearly as if they'd announced them. The amateur thinks invisibility means absence. The professional understands invisibility means presence without attribution. Here's the darker psychological mechanism at play. Human attention is not evenly distributed. It clusters around anomalies, disruptions, deviations from expected patterns. When you suddenly go silent after being vocal, you've created an attention magnet. When you abruptly change behavior, you've activated every threat detection system in your environment. You've achieved the opposite of invisibility. You've become the primary focus of observation. The shadow moves within the noise. It advances during predictable distractions. It repositions while attention is legitimately focused elsewhere. It never creates anomalies that trigger pattern recognition alerts in the minds of observers. Consider how this manifests in modern organizational dynamics. A senior executive at a Fortune 500 technology company recognized that his division was being positioned for elimination during the next fiscal restructuring. He had 18 months before the announcement. His colleagues, equally aware of the threat, responded with the strategies you'd predict. Aggressive self-promotion, visibility campaigns, vocal advocacy for their departments, appeals to senior leadership. They were moving like spotlight seekers in a hunting ground. Every action screamed, "I'm here, I'm valuable, don't eliminate me." Their desperation was palpable, which made leadership's decision easier. Desperation signals diminished value. The executive who understood shadow principles did something entirely different. He didn't increase his visibility. He didn't defend his territory. Instead, he quietly began serving on cross-functional initiatives in divisions that were growing. He contributed valuable work to projects outside his condemned department. He built relationships through competent action, not political maneuvering. He allowed his formal title to remain associated with the dying division, while his actual value became integrated into the expanding divisions. When the restructuring occurred, his department was eliminated as predicted. His former colleagues, despite their visibility campaigns, were offered severance packages. He received a promotion into one of the growth divisions where he'd been quietly positioning himself for 14 months. The power dynamic here reveals something most people never grasp. Visibility is not influence. Position is not power. Your formal title, your organizational chart placement, your official responsibilities, these are the shadow puppets on the wall. The actual structure of power exists in the network of dependencies, obligations, and competencies that you've woven beneath the surface of official recognition. Moving like a shadow requires you to maintain strategic ambiguity about your true positioning. Your opponents should understand your formal position while remaining blind to your actual leverage points. They should see your public moves while missing your structural repositioning. They should focus on where you appear to be while you're consolidating power where they're not looking. If you're still watching, you're already ahead of 90% who clicked away because this makes them uncomfortable. Shadow movement violates every instinct your socialization has programmed into you. You've been trained to seek recognition, to announce achievements, to make your value visible. That training serves the system's need for predictable, manageable participants. It doesn't serve your acquisition of power. The next principle is where it gets truly dangerous, because shadow movement is merely preparation. Strategic thinking identifies the target. Shadow movement achieves position. But dominance requires the final phase, and this is where most people's conditioning completely fails them. The purpose of patient positioning is to enable sudden, overwhelming, irreversible action. Thunder doesn't announce itself. By the time you hear it, the lightning has already struck. The sound is the aftermath, not the warning. This is the principle that transforms strategic thinking and shadow movement from intellectual exercises into actual power acquisition. Most people, even when they've successfully positioned themselves, fail at the execution phase. They escalate gradually. They provide warnings. They give opponents time to adapt, to marshal defenses, to construct counter-strategies. They confuse fairness with effectiveness, mercy with wisdom. This is the terminal error that returns them to powerlessness despite superior positioning. Machiavelli was explicit about this in The Prince. Men ought either to be well treated or crushed because they can avenge themselves of lighter injuries, of more serious ones they cannot. This isn't cruelty, it's mathematical precision about power dynamics. Incomplete action creates wounded enemies. Complete action eliminates opposition. The weak person, having achieved strategic position, acts with restraint. He demonstrates his power through measured responses, proportional retaliation, calibrated pressure. He believes this displays sophistication and control. What it actually displays is hesitation, and hesitation is blood in the water. The powerful person, having achieved position, acts with decisive finality. He strikes once completely, overwhelming any capacity for counterattack. He doesn't wound, he eliminates. He doesn't warn, he executes. The action is sudden enough that opposition cannot organize, comprehensive enough that recovery is impossible, and final enough that the message propagates throughout the system. Challenging this person carries existential risk. Here's what this looks like in contemporary social dynamics. A man discovers that his business partner has been systematically stealing clients and intellectual property for 9 months, preparing to launch a competing venture. The evidence is conclusive. The betrayal is complete. The amateur response is confrontation. Schedule a meeting, present the evidence, demand explanation, negotiate separation terms, part ways with some dignity intact. This is strategic suicide. The moment you reveal that you know, your partner enters crisis mode. He activates his network, secures his resources, constructs his narrative, and positions you as the unreasonable party. You've surrendered surprise, the most valuable asset in any conflict, in exchange for the emotional satisfaction of confrontation. You've chosen performance over power. The strategist who understands thunder principles operates differently. He says nothing. He continues normal operations while quietly securing legal documentation of the theft. He files comprehensive intellectual property claims. He contacts every stolen client with evidence of the deception, offering them superior terms to return. He initiates breach of contract litigation designed to freeze his partner's capital. He registers domain names and trademarks that block his partner's planned brand identity. All of this happens in a 48-hour period. Before the partner realizes the war has begun, he's already lost. His client base is recaptured. His capital is locked in legal proceedings. His brand identity is blocked. His reputation is damaged through documented evidence presented to the business community. The first conversation happens only after the complete execution of the counterstrike. Not as negotiation, as notification of consequences already enacted. This is where you need to be careful. The thunder principle is not about disproportionate escalation. It's not about cruelty for its own sake. It's about understanding that half measures in power dynamics don't lead to half results. They lead to prolonged conflict and eventual defeat. Decisive action is more efficient and paradoxically less destructive than gradual escalation. One comprehensive strike ends the conflict. Multiple partial strikes create blood feuds. The psychological mechanism here is critical. Human beings update their behavioral models based on experienced consequences. Light consequences teach the lesson that challenge is survivable and retaliation is limited. Overwhelming consequences teach the lesson that challenge is existentially dangerous. The first creates emboldened future opponents. The second creates deterrence that prevents future conflicts entirely. But knowing these three principles isn't enough. Most people will learn strategic thinking, shadow movement, and decisive striking as separate skills. That's precisely why they'll fail to achieve dominance. You need to understand how they combine into a unified system, a cycle that compounds power rather than merely exercising it. True dominance emerges not from mastering individual principles, but from operating them as a perpetual cycle. This is the forbidden knowledge that Machiavelli embedded throughout The Prince, but never articulated as explicit instruction. Perhaps he recognized that stating it too directly would reveal the full architecture to those who should remain ignorant of it. Or perhaps he understood that only those capable of synthesizing the pattern would achieve the cognitive sophistication necessary to wield it. The three principles, strategic thinking, shadow movement, decisive striking, are not sequential phases you complete once. They are a continuous cycle that feeds back into itself, each execution generating the conditions for the next iteration at a higher level of power. Here's the architecture. Phase 1. Strategic thinking identifies the target and maps the sequence of moves required for positioning. You operate in the cognitive domain, modeling outcomes, identifying vulnerabilities, calculating timing. Phase 2. Shadow movement executes the positioning without triggering defensive responses. You operate in the physical domain, repositioning resources, building capabilities, establishing leverage, all beneath the threshold of your opponent's threat detection. Phase 3. Decisive striking executes the culminating action with overwhelming force. You operate in the temporal domain, compressing massive action into minimal time, creating impossible-to-counter shock effects. Phase 4. Strategic reset occurs the moment after successful striking. You immediately enter a new strategic thinking phase, now operating from an elevated power position, identifying the next objective, beginning the next cycle. Each complete cycle increases your power base, reduces opposition, and improves your position for the subsequent iteration. This is how individuals ascend from peripheral players to central power brokers, not through single dramatic victories, but through repeated execution of the complete cycle, compounding advantages across multiple domains. Most people experience occasional success with one element. They have a strategic insight, they make a good hidden move, they occasionally act decisively. But they treat these as isolated incidents rather than components of a systematic cycle. They succeed once and plateau, wondering why they can't replicate or build on their success. They've executed a technique without understanding the system. The integrated practitioner operates differently. He's thinking strategically about the next positioning even while executing the current strike. He's moving into shadow even as his previous action concludes. He's analyzing the results of his strike to identify what the next strategic phase should target. There's no gap, no pause, no celebration that interrupts the cycle. Here's what Machiavelli never explicitly wrote, but understood at the deepest level. The cycle itself becomes invisible to those who haven't recognized it. Your opponents see individual actions, a decision here, a move there, an outcome that surprised them. They don't perceive the pattern. They can't identify that you're operating a systematic dominance cycle because their cognition doesn't have the framework to recognize it. They experience the effects without understanding the cause. This is the ultimate form of power. Your methodology itself is camouflaged. Opponents can observe your actions and still fail to learn how you're defeating them. They attribute your success to luck, to circumstances, to advantages you don't actually possess. They never identify the actual mechanism because the mechanism operates in a dimension of reality they haven't developed the perception to observe. The integration of these principles creates what military strategists call OODA loop dominance. You observe, orient, decide, and act faster than your opponents can complete a single cycle. You're executing your third strike while they're still processing your first. You're repositioning for your next objective while they're responding to your previous action. You're always operating in their future, which means they're perpetually reacting to your past moves, never able to catch up to your present position. And here's the darkest truth. Once this cycle is operational in your life, you stop competing with most people. They're not operating in the same game. They're playing checkers while you're playing four-dimensional chess. They're executing individual tactics while you're running multi-cycle strategic campaigns. The gap between your capability and theirs becomes so vast that they literally cannot perceive what you're doing, even when you're doing it directly in front of them. The world is divided into players and pieces. The pieces believe the game is about individual moves. The players understand the game is about systematic cycles. Which one will you be? You now possess the framework, but frameworks without implementation remain intellectual entertainment. Here's how you operationalize Machiavelli's dominance cycle, starting today. Step 1. Conduct strategic mapping today this week. Identify one area where you're currently experiencing resistance or competition. Map the key players involved. Document their visible goals, their apparent strategies, their public commitments. Now go deeper. What are their actual constraints? What are they afraid of losing? What patterns repeat in their decision-making? Spend 90 minutes building a written model of how they think and what they'll predictably do in various scenarios. This is your strategic foundation. Step 2. Identify your shadow path this week, this month. Based on your strategic map, identify what positioning you need to achieve dominance in this situation. Critical question: what can you build, acquire, or establish that strengthens your position without triggering defensive responses from your competition? This might be a capability, a relationship, a resource, or information. The test of proper shadow movement is simple. If you successfully execute it, your opponents should have no idea you've improved your position until the moment you choose to reveal it. Step 3. Prepare your thunder this month quarter. Decisive action requires preparation that remains invisible until execution. Identify what resources, documentation, agreements, or capabilities you need in place so that when you act, the action is comprehensive and irreversible. This is not the action itself. This is the preparation that ensures when you strike, the strike is final. Build your capacity for overwhelming action while maintaining perfect operational security. Step 4. Execute with finality when positioning is complete. When your strategic map is accurate, your shadow positioning is complete, and your thunder preparation is ready, act with sudden decisiveness. Not gradually, not with warning, not with negotiation. Execute the complete action in a compressed time frame that prevents defensive responses. The goal is not to enter conflict, it's to win conflict before your opponent realizes conflict has begun. Step 5. Immediately enter the next cycle, the moment action concludes. The amateur celebrates victory and pauses. The professional understands that completed action creates new strategic opportunities and immediately begins mapping the next cycle. Your successful strike has revealed new information about the system, eliminated obstacles, and elevated your position. These new conditions enable a higher level of strategic action. Begin mapping it immediately. You now know what 99% of people will never understand. Most people reading this framework will intellectually appreciate it and implement nothing. They'll recognize the truth of these principles and continue operating exactly as they always have. That's why they'll remain where they are. The difference between knowledge and power is implementation. The difference between understanding a system and mastering it is repetition. You don't execute this cycle once and achieve dominance. You execute it repeatedly, refining your strategic perception, improving your shadow discipline, increasing your striking decisiveness, until the cycle becomes your natural operating system. Most people will watch this video and do nothing. They'll feel intellectually stimulated for approximately 18 minutes, then return to their reactive existence. They'll continue telegraphing their intentions, operating in the spotlight, acting with hesitation, and wondering why power remains beyond their grasp. That's why they stay powerless, not because they lack opportunity, because they lack the discipline to implement systematic advantage. They consume information about power dynamics as entertainment rather than instruction. They want the feeling of being strategic without the discomfort of actually operating strategically. If you've watched this far, you're different. Something in you recognizes these principles not as abstract theory, but as operational reality. You've experienced the cost of visibility, the price of hesitation, the defeat that comes from incomplete action. You've tried being authentic and transparent and discovered that these virtues serve everyone except you. You're ready for a different approach. You're prepared to operate beneath the surface while others perform on the stage. You're willing to think in timescales that your competition cannot access, move in dimensions they cannot perceive, and act with decisiveness they cannot match. This channel exists for the small minority who understand that power isn't distributed randomly. It flows to those who understand its architecture and implement its principles. Every video on this channel provides frameworks that the masses will consume as entertainment, and the elite few will implement as instruction. If this resonates with the part of you that's tired of performing for others' approval, tired of announcing your intentions only to watch others steal your opportunities, tired of fighting fair in a game where nobody else follows those rules, subscribe now. Turn on notifications. Not so you can collect content, but so you can systematically build capability. The next video will reveal how to identify who has real power versus who has title and position. After that, we'll explore how to construct influence networks that function invisibly. Then we'll examine how to neutralize opposition before opposition recognizes it should defend itself. The choice is yours, but remember, ignorance is not bliss, it's slavery. Every moment you remain unaware of how power actually operates, someone else is using that awareness against you. Every day you broadcast your intentions, someone else is positioning against them. Every time you act with visible hesitation, someone else is seizing the opportunity you're failing to take. Machiavelli wrote The Prince 500 years ago. Human nature hasn't evolved. Power dynamics haven't changed. The only question is whether you'll continue operating according to the comfortable fictions society taught you, or whether you'll embrace the uncomfortable mechanics that actually govern success. Think like a strategist, move like a shadow, strike like thunder. That's how dominance is achieved. That's how power is taken. That's how you stop being a piece on someone else's board and become the player controlling the game. The architecture is now yours. What you build with it is your decision.